When a cocky judge encounters Karoline Leavitt in a routine contract dispute, they anticipate a swift victory, but her meticulous defense transforms the courtroom into a showcase of legal precision. The courthouse loomed like a monument to justice, its towering columns and weathered stone facade casting long shadows over the bustling street below. Inside, beneath the grand ceiling of Courtroom 12, the air thrummed with a quiet electricity. Reporters jostled for seats along the back row, their notebooks poised and pens twitching with anticipation. Legal interns, fresh-faced and eager, whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the key players in the unfolding drama. Curious onlookers, locals with nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon, filled the remaining benches, their murmurs a soft hum that reverberated off the high walls. The scent of aged books and polished wood hung heavy in the room, a subtle reminder of the history and authority embedded in every creak of the floorboards. At the defense table sat Karoline Leavitt, her hands steady as she flipped through a thick stack of notes. Her face was a mask of calm, her dark eyes fixed on the pages before her, betraying nothing of the storm she knew was coming. She was no stranger to the courtroom. This wasn't her first case, nor her 10th. But today felt different. Today she faced not just a legal battle but a test of her mettle, a proving ground where reputation and resilience would collide. Across from her at the plaintiff's table, Richard Calloway adjusted his cufflinks with the casual confidence of a man who'd spent decades bending courtrooms to his will. A veteran litigator with a flair for theatrics, he oozed charisma, his silver hair and tailored suit a testament to a career built on charm as much as skill. And presiding over it all was Judge Walter Grayson, a man whose sharp tongue and disdain for inexperienced attorneys, particularly women, had earned him a reputation as formidable as it was feared. The case itself was deceptively simple. A contract dispute between a mid-sized tech firm and a former employee who claimed wrongful termination. The plaintiff, a mid-level manager named Daniel Harper, alleged that his firing violated the terms of his employment agreement. The company insisted it was a standard at-will dismissal, a right enshrined in state law. On paper, it was the kind of case that rarely made waves, routine, procedural, destined for a quick ruling and a quiet exit. But Calloway saw it as an easy win. A chance to flex his courtroom prowess against an untested opponent. Grayson, peering over his wire-rimmed glasses as he scanned the docket, seemed to share that view. His gaze lingering on Karoline with a mix of skepticism and faint amusement. She knew the odds were stacked against her. Young, unknown, and lacking the pedigree of the elite law firms that dominated the city's legal scene. She was an underdog in every sense. But Karoline Leavitt was ready. She'd spent weeks preparing, poring over case law in her cramped apartment, until the early hours, her coffee growing cold as she traced legal threads through decades of precedent. She'd dissected the contract in question, a dense, 12-page document riddled with clauses and caveats, until she could recite its key provisions in her sleep. She'd anticipated every argument Calloway might throw at her, every dismissive quip Grayson might lob her way. She wasn't here to play the game on their terms. She was here to win on hers. The bailiff's voice cut through the hum of the room. "All rise." A rustle of movement followed as Grayson swept in, his black robe flaring dramatically behind him. He settled onto the bench with the air of a king ascending his throne, adjusting his glasses and casting a cursory glance at the gallery before turning to the attorneys. "Counselor Leavitt," he drawled, his voice low and edged with a smirk. "I see you're representing the defense today. Let's hope this doesn't turn into a lecture hall." A ripple of laughter spread through the gallery, a few interns exchanging knowing grins. Calloway flashed a smug smile, leaning back in his chair as if already savoring the victory. Karoline didn't flinch. She rose slightly, offering a polite nod. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her tone even, her expression unreadable. Then she sat back down and waited. Calloway stood first, buttoning his jacket with a practiced flourish. He launched into his opening statement, his voice smooth and commanding, each word carefully chosen to paint a vivid picture. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the gallery," he began, gesturing broadly, as if addressing a jury rather than a single judge. "This case is about fairness. It's about responsibility. It's about a hard-working man, a dedicated professional, who poured years of his life into a company, only to be cast aside without cause, without warning, without justice." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Daniel Harper trusted his employer to honor the agreement they signed. Instead, they betrayed him, hiding behind the flimsy excuse of at-will employment to shirk their obligations. We're here to hold them accountable. His delivery was flawless, his tone a blend of righteous indignation and measured authority. He cast Harper as a victim of corporate greed, a man wronged by a faceless entity too powerful to care. By the time he finished, he'd woven a narrative so compelling that even the skeptics in the gallery seemed swayed. He sat down with a glance at Karoline that dripped with pity, as if she were a novice about to stumble through her first recital. Grayson turned to her, one eyebrow arched. Chancellor, your response? Karoline rose, smoothing the front of her navy blazer. She didn't pace, didn't gesture, didn't indulge in the theatrics Calloway so clearly relished. She simply stood, her posture straight, her voice steady. Your Honor, opposing counsel has presented a compelling story, she said, her words clipped and precise. Unfortunately, it's not grounded in fact or law. The room shifted. Calloway's smirk faltered, just for a moment. Grayson tilted his head, his curiosity piqued, but his skepticism intact. Miss Leavitt, he said, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. I hope you've got more than bold words to back that up. I do, she replied evenly. Facts. Grayson let out a short, condescending chuckle. Good to hear. I'd hate for this to turn into a pep talk. The gallery laughed again, louder this time, a few reporters scribbling notes as if documenting her impending humiliation. Karoline ignored it all. She reached for a document on the table, holding it with steady hands. Let's start with Colton v. Redbridge, she said, her voice cutting through the lingering amusement. It directly contradicts opposing counsel's claim that this termination was lawful. Calloway scoffed, leaning forward in his seat. That case doesn't apply here, he said dismissively. The circumstances are entirely different. Karoline turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time since the proceedings began. Incorrect, she said, her tone cool but firm. The ruling hinged on a contractual clause limiting termination discretion, identical to the one in this case. Calloway blinked, caught off guard for the briefest of moments. Grayson's fingers, which had been tapping idly against the bench, paused. Miss Leavitt, he said, leaning back in his chair, do you really think a single precedent overrides the fundamental principles of at-will employment? Not a single precedent, Your Honor, she countered, reaching for a stack of files beside her. 5. Preston v. Briarwood Technologies, Wells v. Dartmouth Holdings, Burton v. Vance Corp. All affirming that contracts with specific termination limits override at-will doctrine when the language is clear. Shall I list them? The room fell silent. Grayson stopped tapping entirely. Calloway's grin, once a fixture of his courtroom persona, was nowhere to be seen. The judge adjusted his glasses, peering at her over the rims. Well, Miss Leavitt, he said, his sarcasm sharp but tinged with a flicker of curiosity. Since you're so eager to educate us, by all means, go ahead. The gallery murmured, a mix of amusement and intrigue rippling through the crowd. Karoline didn't hesitate. She lifted the first document, her voice steady and deliberate. Preston v. Briarwood Technologies, 2014, she began. The court ruled that despite an at-will clause, explicit contractual provisions on termination procedures took precedence. That decision was presided over by Judge Holden, who, as you may recall, Your Honor, cited your own opinion in a similar ruling the following year. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. She'd done more than cite a case. She'd tied it to his own judicial legacy. A move as bold as it was strategic. The gallery shifted, a few heads turning, as the mood began to change. Calloway cleared his throat, his voice cutting in. That's still not comparable, he said, his tone firm but less assured. That case involved a severance agreement that wasn't honored, entirely different from what we're dealing with here. Karoline didn't look at him. She simply reached for the next file. Wells v. Dartmouth Holdings, 2017, she continued. No severance agreement, just a termination clause requiring reasonable cause. The employer argued at-will discretion, but the court ruled that contractual obligations supersede at-will doctrine. That precedent was cited again in Burton v. Vance Corp., 2019, where the decision reinforced that at will is not an absolute shield when clear contractual obligations exist. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The pattern is clear. A hush fell over the room. Grayson leaned forward slightly, his elbow resting on the bench, his earlier amusement replaced by something closer to scrutiny. Calloway shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around his pen. He'd come prepared for a routine argument, one where he could lean on his usual rhetoric, charm the judge, and coast to a win. But Karoline wasn't following the script. The judge exhaled, running a hand over his chin. "All right, Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone still edged with skepticism. "That's an impressive list of citations. But let's be honest, case law can be interpreted in multiple ways. Are you really suggesting that all of these cases eliminate an employer's right to terminate under at-will doctrine?" Karoline held his gaze, unflinching. "No, Your Honor," she said. "I'm not arguing that at-will employment is void. I'm arguing that at-will does not override contractual specificity. If a contract explicitly limits termination conditions, then at-will doctrine doesn't apply unless the language allows for it. And in this case, the contract states termination must be based on substantiated cause with supporting documentation." She turned toward Calloway now, her eyes locking onto his. "Do you have that documentation?" The silence was deafening. Calloway's mouth opened, then closed. He shifted his papers, his fingers fumbling slightly as he searched for a response. Karoline knew he wouldn't find one. She'd reviewed every document in the case file, every email, every memo, every scribbled note before stepping into this courtroom. The necessary substantiated cause, the very condition required by the contract, didn't exist. Grayson studied her for a long moment, the patronizing tilt of his mouth gone. "Mr. Calloway," he said, finally, his voice measured, "Counselor Leavitt has presented a strong argument. Do you have documented evidence to prove the termination met the contractual standard?" Calloway hesitated, his mouth pressing into a thin line. He wasn't used to being on the defensive, and it showed. "Your Honor," he began, his tone still carrying the remnants of the confidence he'd walked in with. "At-will employment is the foundation of employer rights. It exists precisely to prevent disputes like this from clogging the courts." Karoline didn't wait for Grayson to respond. She turned slightly, addressing the room as much as the bench. "That's an oversimplification," she said. "At-will employment is a default rule, not an absolute one. The moment an employer adds specific limitations to a contract, they've voluntarily given up blanket at-will discretion. They can't invoke it when it suits them and ignore it when it doesn't." The gallery murmured louder now, a few interns exchanging glances. Even the court reporter, a stoic figure who'd seen countless cases unfold, raised an eyebrow. Calloway's frustration was palpable. Even if there was no documented reason, he pressed, the company still had the right to terminate. Karoline turned fully toward him, her voice calm but unyielding. "If that were true, why include a clause requiring substantiated cause with supporting documentation? Why draft a condition they never intended to follow?" The weight of her words settled over the room like a fog. Calloway had no answer. Grayson leaned forward, his fingers tapping the bench once more. Not in boredom now, but in contemplation. "That's a compelling point, Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone shifting from dismissive to engaged. "I take it you have a proposed course of action." Karoline nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Given that the termination did not meet the contractual requirements, my client is entitled to either reinstatement or financial compensation for breach of contract." Calloway's jaw tightened. The case had slipped from his grasp, and he knew it. Grayson leaned back, studying Karoline with a look that bordered on respect. The courtroom, once a stage for his condescension and Calloway's bravado, had become hers. The judge sat in silence for a moment, his fingers still tapping lightly. Then he turned to Calloway. "Counselor," he said, "your client included a termination clause requiring documented cause. The defense has presented multiple precedents supporting their claim. Do you have any evidence to contradict that?" Calloway hesitated, just a beat too long. "Your Honor," he said, shifting tactics, "if we accept this interpretation, we risk creating an unmanageable standard. Employers will be handcuffed by overly strict documentation requirements." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Handcuffed by their own contract, you mean?" A chuckle rippled through the gallery. Calloway's face tightened. Karoline remained still, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't need to say more. Her argument stood on its own. Grayson exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Miss Leavitt is right," he said finally, the words landing like a gavel strike. Calloway inhaled sharply, about to object, but the judge held up a hand. "This court cannot ignore the plain language of the contract. The employer limited their own discretion and failed to meet their own requirements. That's not a technicality, it's a breach." The ruling came swiftly. "The court finds in favor of the defense," Grayson said. "The plaintiff's claim for wrongful termination is dismissed, and the employer is liable for breach of contract. We'll reconvene to determine damages." The gavel fell, sharp and final. Whispers erupted in the gallery, a mix of stunned murmurs and impressed nods. Calloway slumped in his seat, gathering his papers with a stiffness that betrayed his defeat. Grayson lingered at the bench, his eyes on Karoline. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice lower now, "you'll do well in this profession. Just try not to make too many old judges feel foolish along the way." A few quiet chuckles followed. Karoline allowed herself a small smile. "I'll do my best, Your Honor." She gathered her files and stepped into the hallway, the echo of her heels against the marble floor, a steady rhythm. The tension she'd carried through the hearing lingered, a faint ache in her shoulders, but the weight of her victory was sinking in. Behind her, the murmurs of the gallery spilled out, law clerks whispering, a junior associate nodding in her direction as he passed. She'd turned a routine case into a masterclass, and they'd all seen it. Outside, the crisp afternoon air hit her as she descended the courthouse steps. She paused, pulling out her phone to text her client, "Case dismissed. They're liable. We'll call with details." A reply came almost instantly. "You're incredible. Thank you." She pocketed the phone, her lips curving into a quiet smile. Then she heard her name. "Miss Leavitt." She turned. Richard Calloway stood a few feet away, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither spoke. His fingers gripped his briefcase a little too tightly, his jaw set in a way that suggested he wasn't used to losing, especially not like this. "You put on quite a show in there," he said finally, his voice measured but laced with reluctant respect. Karoline met his gaze. "It wasn't a show," she said simply. "It was the law." A flicker of something, annoyance, acceptance, crossed his face. He let out a short exhale, almost a laugh, then nodded once and walked away. She watched him disappear down the steps, then turned back to the street. Today wasn't just about winning a case, it was about ensuring that the next time she stepped into a courtroom, no one would dare underestimate Karoline Leavitt again.